Hello and welcome to the Bamboo Chalupa Digital Marketing Podcast. My name is Brett Snyder. I am the owner of Knucklepuck, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Nate Shiver, the author of ShiverWeb.com.
Hello, hello.
And so today's episode, we're going to talk about building an audience and a brand voice, and we actually have a special guest. We have a man by the name of Evan Porter. He is the lead copywriter at Nebo, a digital marketing and design agency based out of Atlanta. And he's also a freelance writer that has had his work featured on sites like UpWorthy.com, Ask Men, Lifehack.org, and has even made the front page of Digg and Medium. So, Evan, thank you very much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you guys. I'm really excited to be here.
Very cool. So as we talked about, we want to talk about building an audience and a brand voice. And you started your site, what was it, back earlier this year, right?
Yeah, it was just about April.
Yeah, so about 8 months ago, you started the site, and over the course of those 8 months, while working full time, you've been able to make some very, very significant movement in terms of figuring out who your audience is, building that audience and your brand voice to be able to reach people with the kind of copy that you're writing. And so we want to talk to you a little bit about that, building that audience from scratch and the process that you took to be able to create the product that you have, product being the content that you're producing.
Sure. So, I didn't start my site with any sort of strategic initiative at all. I really just wanted a place to host my copywriting portfolio and, sort of write about things as they came to me. I know Brett has referred to his personal blog as a bit of a sandbox. And so that's kind of the approach that I took in the beginning. I'd write about things that popped into my mind. I'd share what I wrote on Facebook, on Twitter. I get a good response from, my parents and people that knew me, things like that. But a few months in, I started to feel like I had a real opportunity, because it's kind of rare to see writers actually talking about the craft of writing, which sounds kind of funny. There's a lot of motivational type of stuff, stuff that deals with the quote unquote inner game of writing. There's a lot of writing guru type of stuff, download my white paper to grow your blog audience 3x, that kind of thing. But I felt like there were a lot of questions out there that weren't being answered in an accessible way. How do you pitch an article in the real world? What does it mean to create a sense of place in your writing? How can I get a job as a marketing copywriter? Should I write on Medium? Should I write on LinkedIn? So I use my site to talk about things that are personal to me and my growth, things that you'd care about if you knew me personally or were interested in my work. But I also use it to answer some of those questions through the lens of my own experience. And so far, the response has been really good.
And so when you talk about kind of answering those questions, how did you even find these questions? Because a lot of people kind of talk about this idea of, I want to start a blog, but I don't know what to write about. And it sounds like that was kind of your experience at the very beginning, but very quickly you were able to understand, as a writer, this is what I would want to hear about. Is that kind of, if I'm hearing that right, kind of how that progression went through?
Yeah, definitely. I think that there's so many things that go into being a writer in the digital space, and I never come at it from the standpoint of being a writing guru and someone that's climbed the mountain or anything like that. I think that my content takes the approach of, hey, I'm someone that's out there trying to get placements, trying to grow my audience, and these are the kinds of struggles that I have, and so I'm writing about them, through my own perspective, and it's really helpful to read sort of writers' forums and communities and kind of find out what problems other people are having. Quora is a great place where people go, and they're just asking questions. They don't know how to pitch, they don't know how to get a job, they don't know how to, how to start a blog, things like that.
That's one thing, Evan, I think you mentioned about addressing writers' specific problems. I'm reminded of people, who they get rich by quote unquote teaching other people to get rich. And it sounds like kind of in the content copywriting space that there's not a lot of people leading by example. And one thing that I love about your work is that you don't just write the how-to guides, but you actually write stories that are about life, about experience, and then show how to get those publicity. And it's not just taking the meta take; it's also sort of showing by example.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of writing gurus like we talked about, and there are people that make a living writing about writing, and and not that I'm sure they help a lot of people, and that's really good. But for me, I think the approach that I take is, I'm writing stories, I'm doing creative writing, but I'm also writing about what that process is like and what it takes to do that in 2014.
And so we're talking about with the kind of the focus of this episode, we're talking about being able to find your audience where your audience is. It sounds like you found your voice before you found your audience, and you allowed your voice to take you to where that audience is. So how would you kind of frame the difference between, or the importance of finding your brand voice versus finding an audience to consume your content? Where would you kind of rank those in terms of importance? Obviously, they are both important, but they seem to have affected your particular career path in a little bit of a different way than you traditionally hear about.
Sure. So I think that's a really interesting question. What you're writing versus discovered. And I think that's kind of been on my mind a lot lately. I read a lot of marketing publications. I go to marketing events, and you hear, I read case studies, and you hear like, hey, I'm the social media manager for the Atlanta Braves. Let me tell you about all the cool things we did on social. Or my agency did content for Dunkin' Donuts. Like, let me show you the success metrics. And that's great, and you can learn a lot from that type of thing. But I think the challenge is, what if you don't have a brand that has millions of built-in audience members? What if you're starting from scratch and you have to kind of choose between, the kinds of content you're writing and how it's going to get discovered, and you have to kind of think about that all at the same time. So I don't know if you can prioritize one or the other, but I think that it's helpful to have these sort of insights into your audience and what kind of problems they're trying to solve, and that can be sort of a building block for your content. And then you can kind of stand up from there and do bigger things, do more exciting things.
And you talked about going into, the writers' forums, and you touched on that briefly. When you started to get involved in these writers' forums, how could you talk us through a little bit how you approached that, how you, were able to engage with that again in an authentic way to be able to, it sounds like you took a lot from being involved in those communities. How did you go about building your reputation and your brand within those writers' forums?
To be honest, I'm not the most active social person in the entire world. I'm definitely a writer at heart, and then I'm an observer and I'm a reader. So I love going into writers' forums and kind of just looking at what people are talking about and kind of just absorbing the conversation. There's a few places where I do contribute and where I do get involved in the conversation. Quora is one of those places, as I mentioned. I love answering questions there because it's very simple to go there and get involved. You can find a question that you have expertise on. You can lay out an answer. You can link back to your blog. It's very simple. There's other sort of communities where you can get involved in discussions, but that's kind of how I approach it. I like to go in and just see what kinds of problems writers are having, even if it's just from an observatory standpoint.
And that's really interesting just from a tactical standpoint, because, one of the big things with anything in marketing, and we've touched on it a lot in the podcast, where how do you prioritize the time? Everyone seems like, oh, well, you do good marketing by engaging in communities, but there's only so many hours a day. And what you're talking more of a passive engagement where you're taking advantage of these communities to be able to figure out what the audience is interested in and then take your own spin on that. Interesting, because not to say that it doesn't take time, it obviously does, but it is less of an active process to have to go in there and say, well, I have to, like your Quora example, I have to answer one question a day or one question a week, or people are going to forget who I am. You could still get benefit out of these communities, even if you are more of a passive observer than an active participant.
Yeah, and I think exactly what you said. Time is such a precious resource. There's only so many hours in the day, and I can choose to use them writing, reading, interacting. It's just a matter of deciding, which ones do you think you're going to get the most benefit out of? And for me, I love to write, and so I want to get ideas for what to write next. And the easiest way for me to do that is to go and kind of observe and go into research mode rather than making a concerted effort to spend hours and hours interacting with people on a personal level and building my brand that way.
Evan, the conversation about time, I think, ties into something that I really wanted you to elaborate on. So you haven't kept all of your writing and all your content to your own site, to wordsbyevanporter.com. You've also written for Medium. You've also written for LinkedIn Pulse. You've pitched other places. How do you decide what's the trade-off and what's the return for writing and putting in so much time and investment into content that's going to live on other websites and might not, directly benefit your own domain name, which I think among SEOs is going to be a big concern. You're putting in so much time into your content only to, in the end, benefit Medium or benefit LinkedIn. How do you judge? How do you make the call about where to put your content?
Yeah, so I think what's helpful about having a sort of clearly defined content strategy, or at least, an idea of what kinds of content you're going to create for your own site, is that these decisions become a bit easier. For me, I want to write all kinds of things. I want to write funny essays and moving short stories and fiction and screenwriting and all these kinds of things. But on wordsbyevanporter.com, I'm really focused on writing stuff that helps other writers. And so anything that doesn't fit into that mold is a good candidate to go live somewhere else. And in particular, playing off this topic of building an audience from scratch, my audience for that website is certainly growing, but it's not huge. So if I have a piece of content that I feel is has viral potential, then that's definitely something I want to consider placing on a Medium or somewhere that has a larger built-in audience that can give it that sort of content inertia.
And I think it's really cool that you talk about this idea of knowing your mold. And I think that's, at least in my experience, where a lot of folks kind of approach a content strategy without that clearly defined plan, without knowing the mold and knowing what it is that you are looking to accomplish. It's funny because you mentioned at the beginning you didn't really have much of a goal for the site, but now you're saying you know your mold with wordsbyevanporter.com, and when content doesn't quite fit that mold. And I think it's one of the things that, in my experience, coming from the marketing side, where the best writers know kind of what they're trying to do, even if they can't really clearly say, this is what I'm putting on wordsbyevanporter.com. Talk about knowing your mold for that and being willing to say, if something doesn't fit that mold, doesn't mean that it isn't a valuable piece of content to produce. Doesn't mean that my voice can't lend credibility, expertise to this particular subject. And so I think I just kind of want to dig a little bit deeper into that, because I think we really hit on something here, where just that phrase of knowing your mold, where can you give of maybe one of the last sites or one of the last posts that you were saying, hey, I went into this saying I'm going to put this on wordsbyevanporter.com, but as I wrote it, it kind of took a different turn and I realized it would be better suited for another publication.
Sure. Yeah. And I think it is a really interesting decision to weigh. When you have that choice. The last thing I wrote that had a lot of success for me was, the things I'll teach my first kid. It's an article I wrote that ended up going on Medium, ended up going viral to a degree, ended up on UpWorthy, Ask Men, Lifehack. And that's something I definitely considered putting on my site because it ties in heavily with my life. And in addition to helping writers, part of my site is there for me to write about things that are personal to me, and things that you might care about if you knew me or were familiar with my work. But it felt like to me that particular piece of content had a lot of viral potential. And I don't like to use that word viral too much because it can be very broad, but it felt like something that would really do well if I got it in front of a broad audience on a bigger platform. And so that's why I decided not to put that on my site. And you can see the benefits of it because it ends up on UpWorthy, and there's a link back to Medium, right? But there's also a link back to me because they ask me if they can post it, and I get a bio and I get a link to my site. It ends up on Ask Men, the same thing. So I've got all these links coming in back to my wordsbyevanporter.com, even though that's not where I published it.
Hey Nate, you know what this sounds like?
What's that?
This sounds like our flywheel.
It really does. It really does. Giving that initial push to the flywheel, getting it rolling.
And what's really cool about that, for some of our listeners who maybe haven't heard us talk about the flywheel before, it's a very recurring topic that we talk about on the show. And it's this idea that says sometimes you have to generate that momentum, even if it's not ultimately what you were, if ultimately you want to drive more visits to wordsbyevanporter.com, to be able to do that, to build that reputation and to build that momentum, to get the flywheel spinning, you need to be willing to open yourself up to other opportunities. And it sounds like that, from my perspective, was exactly kind of the way that you looked at it. You looked at this to say, I could put this here and I could get the immediate direct, anybody's going to reference back this site on my site, but it may not reach the same number of people. It may be limited to my social media, my social media sphere. But if I can push this out to another site with a little bit of a broader audience that then gets to really kind of own the initial publication, but I still own the voice. And so again, keeping that consistent brand voice throughout anywhere that you're going to publish, but still being able to expand that audience really goes into that balance and that dichotomy we talked about a little earlier.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and one thing, keeping on the building momentum theme, in addition to posting it on these kind of bigger platforms, one thing that you do that I don't see a lot of copywriters do is that you built in sort of a promotion plan to your blog posts, even the ones that weren't directly targeted at writers. Could you talk a little bit about the process of pitching editors? How do you pick the person to pitch? How do you email them? Do you tweet them? Could you talk a little bit about your experience with that?
Yeah, so pitching is a huge topic, and it's really important. Yeah, I think there's a really important distinction to make here too, because there's different kinds of pitching. I know in a previous episode you guys talked about how you get pitched by people who want you to write about their product on your blog. People saying, "Hey, give me some free PR."
Oh, yeah.
But there's the other the other kind of pitching though is I think what we're talking about here, where you're trying to get an editor at a publication interested in content that you genuinely think that their audience will enjoy. And I think there's a bit of a pervasive belief that sort of bleeds between these two types of pitching, that you have to have a relationship with the editor or publication. And I think that's definitely true for the cases where you're pitching your brand or pitching your product. But when you're pitching content, in my opinion, I think you just need to have a great idea, and you need to be able to convince that publication that you can execute that idea.
So let's take kind of a spin on that. Let's say that I am a company that has a product, but the content that I'm writing, maybe it's around the product. Let's take an example, a product that I really like that does a really good job with content marketing is BuzzStream. BuzzStream works kind of in the content promotional space, and they do a lot of publishing content on their own site and on complementary sites that talks about the idea of content marketing, digital marketing. How do you go and you actually take the fact that you have this product, and you are obviously a business that sells this product? How do you translate that expertise while still making the focus be on the content and the quality of that content and the story, and not seeming like something promotional?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, it has to come down to, you have to create something that people want to read. You have to create something that people want to use or just read for enjoyment. And so that really has to be the focus. And you can have these sort of tangential benefits, but I think that if you're not offering something to a publication, to an editor, to a website owner that their audience is going to benefit from, I don't know that there's really any pitching tactic that can save you other than paying them.
Right. The best pitch is a great product, and in this sense, it's great content is able to actually kind of to go out there and pitch itself almost.
Yeah, definitely. I think I think pitching is really simple. It's what's the benefit to your audience, and can I make you believe that I can actually execute this, and that I can actually bring a positive result to your site. And I think if you can do those two things, then you're going to have success.
So what do you do when looking at a publication that that you're potentially considering pitching? What is your process to be able to, do you have kind of an internal checklist where you say, okay, how do I know that my content does fit their audience? How do I know that the content that I've written is positioned in a way that once I pitch this, I feel confident it can be accepted? Do you have anything that you go through to try to qualify sites that meet your brand voice or that their audience aligns with your type of content? Does that play into your decision on where and how often to publish?
Yeah, in a way. I mean, I think that being a voracious reader helps. Having a list of sites that you read, that you enjoy, that are relevant to your interests, kind of building that in your day to day can be really helpful. So I read a lot of Medium. I read a lot of UpWorthy and BuzzFeed, just trying to keep on top of of the trends. And so I don't know that I have a checklist, but I think you get an idea if you read something over time, what kind of content they go for. And what's interesting is that, so I think that most publications will break the mold if your content is good. They have certain things they're looking for, but really what they're looking for is great content when it comes down to it. So the last thing they want to do is publish all the same stuff all the time, or the same kind of thing all the time. So if you can offer something that's new, but that's sort of tangentially related to what they're they typically publish, that could be another way to be successful.
And I think that's a very, very thin line, much thinner than I think most people are willing to admit, where how do you balance between knowing that I'm going to write something that aligns with the interest of this audience, but also writing it in a way that is going to be different enough that it entices that audience to devote some of their time to it. Not everybody is a voracious reader. I am guilty of really being a pretty terrible reader in a lot of ways. But where is that? How do you kind of find that balance? It's something that's always been so interesting to me, is to find that balance of where are you similar enough that you can get the interest, but different enough that you can keep the interest?
Sure. So yeah, that's a great question. It is a fine line. And I think that there's risk involved in this for sure. I mean, if you're going to write something that isn't going to be owned content, there's definitely a chance that you may not be able to find a place for it. You go in, as well prepared as you possibly can be, so that that's not the outcome. But hey, it's happened to me before, and it's not fun, and it's not fun to lose hours working hard on something. You got to take big risks to have big payoffs.
That's well put. Brett, I know that a lot of the reading that me and you especially do is in the SEO space. And I think this is something that you see happen in our space and in the blogs that we read. Our audience has a high interest in, say, a beginner's guide to webmaster tools. But how many guides to webmaster tools are out there? I mean, there's dozens, if not hundreds or thousands, that are all very well done. And you can publish another one and it might do well. It's not really taking a lot of risk, but you're also not getting a lot of reward. And a lot of times the big rewards that we see, at least in our industry and the industry publications, are the ones that do something in a little bit novel way. I remember Dan Schuer a few months ago took something that everyone has written about, Google's keyword planner, and he showed how to use it a little bit differently, and it was huge. And I think it was a good example of how you can kind of do something that's interesting to the audience, but it's different enough. And I think that's a delineation that Evan's kind of brought out and is good to remind ourselves a lot of.
No, and I absolutely agree. It's why I kind of dig into that question, because it is something that is very subtle. I almost can't read most sites in December because there's only so many where is SEO going in 2015 that you can read before you hear content is king, write for your audience and engage on social media. Where do you find the ways to step out? And that's why I'm so interested in, I don't even know what to call it really. If it's a creative process, if it's more of a conscious process that you go through, just to be able to say, I know what this audience is interested in. Now, how do I put my spin on it? And I think that segues nicely into kind of the second half of our episode here, where we really want to talk about defining that brand voice. We've touched on it a bit as we've been going through, but Evan, let me ask you this. When I say the word defining your brand voice, what does that mean from your perspective?
Sure. So to me, brand voice means, what are your readers or what's your audience going to expect from you? It means a level of consistency. And so I think having a consistent brand voice is how you start to build a following. I think you can have some level of success without a consistent brand voice. I mean, I think you can create individual pieces of content that perform well, that are all different, but you're never going to get that synergy, or that, you're never going to get more than the sum of the parts without that consistent brand voice. So people will follow you on social media if they know that they can expect X, Y, and Z from you, and X, Y, and Z aligns with what they're interested in. But if they liked one piece of content from you, but the rest didn't really speak to them, then you've probably missed a big opportunity to gain a fan.
And I think that's a cool way to put it. And something that I've always kind of looked at is, where does the author and the writer, when we talk about the brand voice, is kind of where those two collide. When does the author or the piece of content become the author's voice? And when does the author really become an external presentation through the content that they write? And I really like the fact that you can talk on this idea of consistency, because that is so important really with anything from a marketing promotional standpoint, whether that be content, whether that be products, whether that be social media, because you're not counting on going viral. You actually have that plan to go out there and say, if I am going to consistently stick to this same approach, and not the same content, but the same approach, the same type that my audience can then expect something out of me, that really allows you to be able to, going back to your phrase that I keep repeating because I love it, going back to knowing your mold, knowing where it is that you can go out there and win is something that is really largely undervalued in terms of in terms of writers, in terms of marketers, in terms of designers, developers, even go outside the digital space. This idea of being able to have a consistent presentation of who you are, and especially since you focus on writing in the digital space, where that persona you have to maintain that persona across these different publications or across these different mediums if you expect to build that audience and that brand voice.
So, Evan, with your role as lead copywriter, and especially just as a copywriter at an agency, you're working not only with your team, but also with several different clients. So I think you have a lot of expertise in developing a brand voice, but also maintaining it. So when a new client comes to you, I mean, it might be, they might kind of get how to start off with, but how would you recommend, and how do you keep that brand voice disciplined and consistent day to day, day in, day out?
Yeah. And that's definitely a tough one. In terms of defining a brand, I think when you hear that phrase, you think, what's unique about me, right? What's unique about my brand and the way that we create content and the way that we write. And, being unique is really, really hard these days. The sheer amount of content that's out there, it's incredibly tough to stand out as someone who has a truly unique voice. And so I think what's really important then is authenticity. And kind of an offbeat example here is, I'm interested in screenwriting and I spent some time in the screenwriting community. And they always say in screenwriting that the first 10 pages of your script have to hook the reader. And if you don't hook them in the first 10 pages, then you lose them. And so what happens then, as this advice has sort of been propagated, is that in amateur scripts, you start to get these opening scenes of scripts that are the craziest thing you've ever read. These hyper violent, absurdly over the top scenes that are designed to get your attention, and then you get people who are trying to emulate Quentin Tarantino or Diablo Cody or people that have a very specific, unique voice. And it's just not authentic. It's uniqueness for the sake of uniqueness. And I don't think that works. So I think what's important is, when defining a brand voice is to just be you. And you have to be, going back to that phrase again, you have to kind of, know your mold. You have to be comfortable with who you are. And it's okay if you're not a funny brand. You don't have to be Old Spice or Charmin. If you do a good job at being encouraging and informational, then that's great. And on the other hand, if you are funny and you don't do as great a job at being useful and thorough and informational, then that's okay too. So you have to kind of own who you are and use that to define your brand voice.
And I think that just is even beyond writing. I mean, I try to take a lot of those same principles, and I'm actually taking some notes for myself for the next presentation I do. I do a fair number of presentations for SEO. And they always tell you, hey, you want to present somebody with a problem at the very beginning. Your first couple slides should present them with a problem. Slides after that should make them understand why that's a problem to them. And the other 90% of your presentation should be about addressing that problem and how you can help people solve that. And it sounds like it's a very similar approach, this idea of authenticity, this idea of making sure that you can be natural and that you can be relatable. People want content that they can relate to. They want to buy from brands that they can relate to, that they feel understands who they are and what their needs are. And content is an extremely valuable tool to accomplish exactly that. It's really going out there and being able to say, again, your brand voice will draw your audience. There are people that will understand who you are and relate to that. And those are the people that you're going to be able to connect with, because if you try to go through and do something inauthentic, it's almost like the example that you talked about with consistency before, where you might get a couple of pieces of content that, really take off, but the goal, you're counting on going viral. You're counting on the fact that something's going to break the mold. Where if you can create a consistently authentic and relatable brand voice, you don't have to rely on that luck factor of going viral, and you can build more of an established audience that has similar beliefs, similar need states that really align with the type of content that you can produce.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nate, going back to your question about how you stay consistent, I did want to speak to that briefly. I do think, I'm not a huge fan of when brands will say, our brand voice is going to be friendly, it's going to be smart, it's going to be helpful, because those don't seem super actionable to me. But they can be a decent starting point. And one thing that I have found really interesting is if you go to MailChimp and look at their style guide, it's sort of a manifesto about, two internal employees about how to write in MailChimp voice. And it does kind of go down that road of, MailChimp voice is friendly and it's helpful, but it does some really interesting things in terms of it contains some examples of what MailChimp voice looks like and what it doesn't, which is helpful. And it also tells you what MailChimp voice is not, in the sense of we're clever, but we're not childish. So I think that adds a extra layer of context that can really help people understand the brand voice. Also, when you're working with a lot of different writers coming together to work on projects, I think helping people understand audience and goals is really important to consistency. Not understanding the audience is one of the biggest problems I see in first drafts of content, because if you think about shifting perspectives, it can change the entire piece, and it skews the perspective and the way the information is presented. So making sure everyone's on the same page with those things is really helpful.
So are there any, shall we say, questions that you would ask? Say you have a client come in and you're kicking off a content campaign to help them be able to dig past the, oh, well, we want to be friendly, or we want to be nice, or we want to be informative. Is there anything that, any kind of deeper questions that you can probe the client, or even individual writers can kind of be a little bit introspective here to figure out how do we get past these vanity phrases of what you want your brand to be and get down to the heart of how you can craft the best content possible?
Yeah, I think if you think about what you want people to feel at the end of a piece of content, that can kind of help you work backwards. So, if you say you want your content to be friendly, I'm not sure exactly what that means, but if you say we want people to feel like they can trust us at the end of this piece of content, now that's something that I think you can put into action.
No, I think that is an outstanding way to put it, because then you're focusing on what the person, how are they supposed to react? What is supposed to be the step that they take, whether that's an emotional step, whether that's an unconscious step towards relating more to your brand, where friendly is not a strategy. How do you actually go out there and say, okay, friendly might mean that you want somebody to be able to say, hey, I would go up and talk to somebody wearing that t-shirt on the street. And now we can get to, okay, well, what would drive you to that? So Nate, I think we talked about this before. We talked about this process of the 5 whys.
Oh yeah. Yeah. In fact, there's a famous book about it where you take your problem and you ask why. Then you ask why again, and you ask why 5 times. And by the time you get to that 5th why, you have the inner essence of what the problem is and usually what the solution is also.
So if we go back to Evan's example with, since I want my brand to be friendly, you ask why? It's like, oh, well, I want people to feel like they can have a personal connection with us. Why? Oh, because a personal connection allows them to really kind of see how the product may fit into their daily life. Why? Oh, because the product is something that really goes out there and can help make the world a better place. And that's kind of a very convoluted final answer there, but just to illustrate the point, where you get past, I want to be friendly, and you get down to the real reason of how does that connect with your audience in a way that drives them to take your desired action.
I like that. Well, Evan, occasionally we do this segment called just rapid fire tips, which is if you could give 3 to 5 very quick pieces of advice to any aspiring writer or content marketing manager who wants to expand their audience and define their brand, what would it be? Yeah,
love this. Number 1, I'd say ship. I think is it Seth Godin who says that shipping is the most important thing. There's definitely things when you're creating content that you should be holding back to perfect. But a big part of this is just getting your content out there and making sure that it's good, but not necessarily spending, not necessarily laboring over executing at the absolute highest level. The better you execute, the better success you'll have. But if you don't at least play the game, you can't win. I'd also add, look for new content platforms to contribute to, even fledgling content platforms. Because what happens with these places is they start to get popular, and then millions of people are writing or submitting to them, and then they start to scale back the reach or access that they allow writers. So if you think you've found a place that it could be the next thought catalog or the next medium, try to get in on the ground floor, try to get in front of some new audiences, and take some risks there. Third, have a thick skin. Your pitches are going to get ignored or shot down. Your content's not always going to go over well. Some people are going to react poorly to it, especially as you start to get into that broad viral content stage. You just have to remember that you can't please everyone. Not everyone is an ideal member of your audience. You gotta learn to brush this stuff off, keep taking risks, and wait for the payoff.
All right, and I'm going to add my rapid fire tips to the end of this, but I'm going to add these in from the top tips that I took from what Evan shared with us today. And the first one has to be, you have to know your mold, because knowing your mold allows you to create that consistent brand voice. And whether you're going to promote that on your own site or whether you're going to try to push that out somewhere else, knowing your mold allows you to be able to produce something that is going to be consistently reflective of who it's going to be, consistently relatable to your audience. The second rapid fire tip is remembering that sometimes it does pay to push your content out to another publication if that publication can expand the scope of your audience. So if you have something that you think, yes, this does fit my mold, it fits exactly the brand voice that I have for my site, but I also think it can appeal to a much broader audience, that may be worth considering pitching to a bigger publication, because once you get that flywheel spinning, you're able to say, hey, if I get to the top page of Medium, that is going to relate to UpWorthy. That's going to relate to Ask Men. Pulling from Evan's experience to understand that putting your content somewhere else does have a benefit back to your own site. And the last thing that I want to do, and Evan said this at the very, very end of the episode, and it's one of my favorite things he said the entire time, and that's to work backwards from what you want people to feel and create your content that way. If you can understand the fact that content has a very emotional connection to people and provides a very real opportunity for you to connect with people on a more intimate level, where you can focus on what you want people to feel and how you want them to react to your content, you can work backwards from there to be able to understand what words you want to use, what brand voice, how you want to structure the content or the length of it, and everything can be framed through that idea of what you want people to feel when they read your content.
All right. Well, you can find show notes, links to things we've mentioned, and our contact information at bamboochalupa.com. A huge thanks to Evan for being on the show. Evan, where can people go to find your work and get in touch?
Best place to start is go to wordsbyevanporter.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at ESPorter.
All right, we'll do both of those things. And also, you can subscribe to the podcast in iTunes or Stitcher. We love to hear your comments, and also please give us a rating while you're there. It gives us great feedback and helps others discover the show. So for Brett Snyder, I'm Nate Shiver. Thank you for listening.